small passenger plane tragically fell from the sky, a victim of a terrible accident. Surprisingly, 9 people on board survived, but their joy vanished in an instant. The plane was shattered into pieces. The GPS and wireless communication systems were completely destroyed. An area of 600 square miles all around was covered by mountains and dense rainforests. But the most astonishing thing was that they seemed to be targeted by some terrifying presence. Every night, one person would die without fail. This was truly like a living hell, where mere survival was the greatest challenge. Welcome to the latest suspense thriller, 9 Bodies, released in 2025. On a small plane flying from Guatemala to the USA, a passenger noticed that the flight path seemed wrong. The air hostess explained that due to bad weather on the original route, the pilot had chosen an alternative path, which would add an hour to the journey. Initially, no one paid much attention, but when the plane suddenly started to judder, it became clear that the plane's GPS had malfunctioned and fuel was running dangerously low. The pilot tried to call the tower for help, but the radio too had gone silent. The pilot seemed to foresee the end, so after lowering the flight altitude, he took out his phone and started recording a message. When the engine stopped spinning, the plane turned into a lump of iron, plummeting rapidly towards the ground. Fortunately, the plane crashed from a limited height, and the rear cabin remained largely intact. Except for an air hostess who hadn't fastened her seatbelt, most passengers suffered only minor injuries. A bespectacled man, Kevin, immediately recognized that the air hostess had a broken spine and couldn't be saved. A bearded man, Zach, suggested checking on the pilot. He forced open the cockpit door and found a wooden stick pierced through the pilot's chest, but he was still breathing. The bespectacled man was about to pull out the stick when a burning smell filled the cabin. The engine had caught fire. Zach immediately jumped out of the cabin, but not to extinguish the fire, rather to retrieve his luggage. Thankfully, the fire wasn't large and was quickly put out by the passengers. A little later, the unconscious pilot was taken out of the cabin. His lungs were punctured, and his life was in constant danger. Unfortunately, there was no signal here, making it impossible to call for outside help. A middle-aged couple was quite optimistic, believing that a rescue team would arrive soon. As they talked, their eyes kept darting towards the man's suitcase. If they still had time for gossip, it meant they hadn't realized the impending danger. Another young couple, Amy and her husband, noticed something moving in the woods. Amy's brow instinctively furrowed. Now, all the survivors were in the dark, not even knowing their geographical location. Sonia, a long-haired woman who traveled frequently, speculated that this might be a tropical forest in Mexico. At least a 600-square-mile area was covered entirely by mountains and rainforests. Moreover, the plane's tracking system was damaged, so a rescue team wouldn't arrive anytime soon. As everyone was panicking, Zach stepped forward and encouraged everyone, saying that if they stuck together, they wouldn't be stranded here. The most urgent task was for everyone to get to know each other. Zach introduced himself first, saying his name was Zach, and he was an investigator for an insurance company. Such people often have sharp observational skills. He was the first to check on the pilot after the crash, as the pilot was the most likely person to help them get out of this predicament. Zach had previously been investigating a case of arson and insurance fraud, which led to retaliation against his home. This long journey was somewhat of an escape for him. He even suspected that the plane crash was also due to his enemies seeking revenge. However, his baseless speculation was automatically ignored by everyone. This wasn't a movie where there would be so many conspiracies. Now it was the turn of the bespectacled man, Kevin. He introduced himself and said that he was once a surgeon. That's why he immediately said the air hostess couldn't be saved. Now he works in the medical equipment business and was on this trip to purchase supplies in the USA. The long-haired woman, Sonia, traveled constantly, but when asked about her profession and past, she flatly refused to answer the question. The man who risked his life to save his luggage was named Carlos, a professional wrestler. He valued honor greatly and was on this trip to participate in a league. There was also a young couple traveling for their honeymoon, and the middle-aged couple ran a motel back home. The husband suffered from heart disease and had to take medication regularly to survive. Including the critically injured and unconscious pilot, there were a total of 9 survivors. The insurance investigator, Zach, showed leadership qualities and spontaneously began to assign tasks. All remaining supplies in the plane had to be collected. The fresh water inside would last for 3 days. Looking at the air hostess's body, which was gradually stiffening, Zach felt it had to be moved out of the cabin. Otherwise, it would surely attract maggots over time. He and Kevin found a hollow spot, which was the best place to put the body. Just then, someone came running to inform them that the unconscious pilot had regained consciousness. Zach was immediately excited. He had too many questions to ask him, but the pilot's lungs were damaged, and he couldn't speak a complete sentence even after half a day. That's when Zach thought of Kevin, who used to be a doctor. "Can't you cure him?" Zach asked. Kevin immediately shook his head and refused. The pilot's condition required surgery. He said that it had been years since he had held a scalpel, and here in the deep jungle, there were no conditions for performing surgery, not even basic surgical knives and disinfectants. Seeing Kevin's passive attitude, everyone temporarily gave up the idea of treating the pilot. The middle-aged woman, Lisa, used the available food from the plane to prepare a simple lunch for everyone. After eating and drinking their fill, everyone's confidence improved significantly. Sonya speculated that there might be a signal on that mountain peak. The wrestler said that if food wasn't enough, they could hunt in the mountains. Fresh water was also readily available in the forest, just needing simple filtration. Even if rescue remained elusive, everyone was confident about their survival. Only the occasional cough from the pilot nearby was a bit disheartening. They all, as if by unspoken agreement, looked at the only doctor. Kevin couldn't bear it anymore and finally decided to take a risk. Under his guidance, everyone began to search for surgical tools. The first aid box had ready-made antiseptic ointment and bandages. Sonya found high-proof alcohol and a few bottles of water in the cabin, and the bearded uncle, Davis, pulled out the most crucial item, a surgical knife. When everything was ready, Kevin used the strong alcohol for simple disinfection. Without any anesthetic, the pain the pilot endured was unimaginable. Fortunately, the surgery went very smoothly. Kevin breathed a sigh of relief, stating that the pilot's injuries were no longer critical, but he had to get through the post-operative shock. Moreover, in this environment, the possibility of wound infection was high. Nevertheless, things were moving in a positive direction. Only the young couple in the cabin remained deeply worried about the current situation. What if we encounter wild beasts? When will the rescue team arrive? Just then, it suddenly got dark outside, and a black shadow darted through the trees. Amy saw it clearly this time. Were there other people in the forest? Meanwhile, two middle-aged couples sitting out with the wrestler, especially his precious suitcase. Taking advantage of his absence for a moment, Lisa cautiously decided to see what was hidden inside. But as she approached, she realized that the suitcase had a password lock. Unbeknownst to them, the sky darkened. Several survivors fell into a deep sleep. Only the newlywed husband remained vigilantly watching outside the window. However, his vision was limited, and he didn't know that the wrestler was still training. Just then, a black shadow quietly approached, picked up a jacket, and covered the pilot's head with it. The next morning, when everyone woke up, they saw only the pilot's lifeless body, his eyes wide open. The doctor was utterly confused. There was no infection in the wound, nor any internal bleeding. How did he die? The only explanation was post-operative shock. Everyone felt a pang of regret, thinking they should have arranged for someone to stay with him last night. Another day passed, and another body was added. Amy felt that they should bury both him and the air hostess, but most people disagreed, believing that when the rescue team arrived, the bodies should be returned to their loved ones. Poor souls, they still naively believed they could be rescued, unaware that the Grim Reaper's scythe was approaching step by step. This was the content of the first episode of 9 Bodies. This series has a total of 6 episodes, with 1 episode released each week. Judging by the quality shown in this episode, it seems worth following. At least the characters of all the survivors have been basically established, and the story background has been largely explained. Especially, all the suspense elements have been very well laid out. For example, why did the plane malfunction and run out of fuel? What is Sonya's true identity? What is inside the black suitcase? Who was that black figure? And is the murderer of the doctor among the 8 surviving individuals? However, from the known information, this is absolutely impossible. After all, these passengers were from different walks of life and had no prior connection whatsoever. There was absolutely no motive for murder, and by just looking at the title, the ending can be guessed. At least 9 bodies will appear in the end, including the air hostess who died earlier, only one of these people should survive. However, whether that person is the killer is yet unknown. Currently, the only thing that can be confirmed is that the bearded uncle, Davis, will definitely not survive until the end. He suffered from heart disease a year ago and now relies on medication. The doctor had expressed concern about whether he had enough medicine. It seems highly likely that the bearded uncle will die due to heart problems. However, at present, the most tragic fate seems to be that